someone was trying to determine where to put a well, and they did have someone to actually do a witching of the area, and when the person did it, apparently he was familiar with that operation. So the guy found the spot, and he told him, he says, don't know how deep the water is, but there's a lot of water here, was the way that the email read. And they went, set up the well driller there and went down about 200 feet and hit a vein of water that forced the steel out of the hole that they were drilling in. And apparently the force of the water flooded the valley in the area where they were punching the well. So they hit enough volume of water that had pressure under it that came to the surface. And said VDOT actually had to put a sign up in the area because of the high water. Thought that one was interesting. We got to the point with the PowerPoints on Tuesday that we were beginning to talk about moisture availability. And I've told you before that I try to pick up different bits from news and weather and so forth. But this morning, I was watching the weather on the TV as I was trying to get my breakfast together, and the weather forecaster came on, and he said that, talking about the soil moisture and the rain that we've got. And he made the statement that in the month of June, we were 10 inches above normal in rainfall in our immediate area, which sort of the foothills of the Blue Ridge. And he said since that time, we've only accumulated 6 inches of rain. So that means July, August, and the month of September. So we've gotten 6 inches as compared to being 10 inches above normal for the month of June. And that's a pretty good example of the variations that we have in moisture as it comes around to us. We have some seasonal differences. And over the last several years, we've had what I kind of view as not really extremes, but we've had abnormalities in not only our moisture, but in our temperature. And if you look at it on a seasonal basis, over the course of a year, our temperature and rainfall or moisture accumulations have been basically average, about what we would normally get in a year or season. But we have been gaining those averages because of extremes. We've had extremely wet weather, and then we've had dry weather. But on the average is a product of the extremes. So if we were really wet and then we get really dry, the average is going to look about normal. Same thing with temperature. We get really hot, we get really cold, the average looks about normal. So that's one of the things that the climatologist folks are saying is occurring with our climate or our weather conditions on a yearly basis, that we're getting more extremes. And I wouldn't disagree with them about that. That's sort of a situation that we're operating under. But it's okay as long as we're in a situation where we can operate under those conditions. And that with that in mind, that's the reason that a lot of irrigation now is being used in agricultural commodities. There are some crops that you can't acquire crop insurance for if you don't have the availability of water to supplement your crop growth. So,
insurance.
Mm-hmm. Tyler's giving me a puzzling look and says crop insurance. Yeah, crop insurance is an insurance policy that will guarantee a certain yield. And I'm not going to get into crop insurance because it's a real complicated element, and it varies with every crop. Some crops it's available for, some others it's not. But tobacco, apples, peaches, corn, soybeans, cotton.
So basically, any common.
Not any common, but it depends. It depends upon on those areas. If you're interested in crop insurance, there's a lot of information available. I've actually had a couple of folks that came out of this program that are now crop insurance adjusters. They work with federal crop folks to evaluate crops, and they travel. They get paid well, and it's a real good employment opportunity. But it's one that changes. There's always rumor that it's going to be eliminated and things of that type. But it is a key component in an agricultural production because of the extensive costs that go into the production of a crop. But you can insure against, for apples, for example, you can insure against the loss of crop to frost, or to hail, or to drought, or extreme hot temperatures, which would damage the quality of the crop. You have an option whether you can have a processing type crop, which would mean going to juice manufacturers or canneries, or you can have a fresh fruit option, which means that your crop is destined to go into the fresh market, and the stipulations and requirements for that one are much more rigid than a processing crop. So there's a lot of different caveats to that. So, but moisture availability is something that we can hopefully, by the manipulation of your crop, your land, your cultural practices, that and possibly the use of supplemental irrigation, ensure that you do have a crop that's available for sale. Some types of production require that you have moisture or water available to put on a regular basis. And one of the things, we don't think of things like golf courses as being a crop, but it is to maintain that turf, the greens and the fairways and so forth, to have it suitable for the recreational experience and the play that they do. You have to maintain that in a fairly lush growing condition. And to do that, because they have to mow it regularly, 2 or 3 times a week generally. Greens they generally mow every day, but you have to have water available to do that, to keep those things in a playable condition. So that's an essential thing, to have water available for golf courses. Most of that's done by sprinkler irrigation. Most of it's done with a permanent type setup with underground piping and then sprinkler heads that you can either put in, or they are pop-up type sprinkler. Pop-ups are generally used around greens, but that is an essential thing. A lot of the tobacco production in our area in years past has required that there be some supplemental moisture added. Corn, the one grower that I mentioned to you on Tuesday that had the 100-acre pivot irrigation, that they do that to ensure that they've got a volume of corn to feed the 800 cows that they're milking on a daily basis. Then they've got all the other animals that they have to, the heifers and calves and so forth, they have to have food for. So, they're almost like a golf course. They've got to have that 100 acres of corn, and then they've got other fields that they work with. Some folks are taking care of their moisture needs by selection of fields. In the area where we are, there's a lot of high demand for what we call bottom land, or land that's on the edges of streams and rivers. Generally, that's more of fertile land, and it's in close proximity to the water. Generally, it has a greater water holding capacity, and the water's there if they have to supplement it to do that crop. Somebody have a question? Okay. One of the areas when I'm talking about bottom land, if any of you have traveled Route 58 between South Boston and Danville, there's an area in there on the Dan River, on actually both sides of 58, that in years past they've grown with corn. They've got that planted in soybeans this year. And I haven't been down there for probably a month, but the last time I was through there, it looked as though there might have been 500 or 600 acres of soybeans in those river bottoms there. And that is a real wonderful soil situation, and they will yield a real nice harvest off of those beans the way they appear. Now there is an element of concern with folks that do plant crops in bottom land. In case what? It can flood. It can flood. We had some bottom land that we owned at one time that I was using to grow pumpkins in. And the first couple of years that I grew pumpkins down there, I got along really well with it. And about the third year, we had a tropical storm come through, and we got 10 to 12 inches of rain. And the little bottoms that we were growing the pumpkins in flooded. And after the water went down, I went down and looked, and I had pumpkins that were hanging in some of the sycamore trees on the lower end of the field. They were 10 or 12 feet off the ground. So lost that crop because of excessive water accumulation in those bottom areas. So, there's a risk, reward, and benefit type deal. All right, that sort of finishes up the moisture portion of this chapter on climate, and we now need to talk about temperature. And I mentioned that a little bit while ago when we were talking about the extremes, the product of the extremes being the average temperature. But temperature may be the most important factor in whether or not a crop can be grown and when to plant a crop in a given location. We talked a little bit the other day about the planting of cabbage in our area. Not much cabbage is grown down in the south side, but here in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, there's quite often a rotation of cabbage. It's gotten much more lucrative in the last 7 or 8 years than it was before that. But the guys that are growing cabbage are generally located, the farmers are generally located on the higher elevations, probably 2,500 to 3,000 feet in elevation in mountain areas of Carroll and Patrick County. Some grown in Floyd County, of course, but those guys are innovative enough that they like to have as many seasons as they could possibly do. So they'll grow a crop on the top of the mountain, then they'll come below the mountain and grow a crop, and then they'll go back to the top of the mountain again. But this is determined, the locations of these crops is determined by temperature. There's quite a bit of broccoli being grown in this area now that was not being considered as a crop opportunity 10 or 12 years ago. But there's been a movement from the Southwest Farmers Market at Hillsville. They've worked to generate market opportunities for broccoli with a small chain store operation that's down in Abington. And there's probably 50 or 100 acres of broccoli that's been grown under contract for what we call Food City. It's a chain store that's down in the southwest part of the state. But the differences in temperature will determine whether a crop can be grown. Tobacco, for example, is a crop that's generally grown from the eastern edges of our service area down through south side. And when I'm speaking of tobacco, I think of primarily the flue cured types of tobacco, as opposed to the burley types or the dark tobacco. Some of the dark tobacco is even grown in southwestern part of the state.
Mr. Ayers, I
Yes.
a huge difference because I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, the summertime there is really beautiful and very green and flowery. Whereas here, I feel like if you don't have enough shade for your flowers, they die off really quick.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. I just, like, I moved from Virginia Beach to here, so, you know, I've been living in the cities as long as I've been living here in Virginia. So, I don't know, I just noticed a huge difference, like, because the sun gets so hot, you know?
It does.
And the
And
sun,
and your area that you're from in Erie, Pennsylvania, how close were you to the lake?
right close, I mean, you could walk up, like,
Okay.
walk up the road.
And that's something that we're going to talk about as we get a little farther. The tempering effect that large bodies of water will have on the surrounding area. You know, you were in, we've used the term macroclimate, microclimate. You were in a macroclimate around that lake that was tempered by the lake. Your temperature was modified because of that large body of water.
Mm-hmm.
And also the rainfall that you got was changed because of that. And in the winter, when you went to the other extreme, you got more snow there than you did 100 miles in. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that's, again, because of that large body of water. So, you know, we're going to include some discussion about that, you know, as we move along. But you raise a very good point. And that's just an example of the differences in location in the way that it will determine what crops can be grown and planted and their opportunity for survival and benefit. So, but I'm glad you brought that up, and don't let me forget to include that as we move along, because there's some other points that I want to bring up about that. Okay?
Yeah, the soil, you know, the soil in Virginia Beach is super sandy.
Yeah.
And that had, I think, a lot to do with the survival of my flower.
It either makes them survive or not, unless you alter that soil. In other words, incorporate some organic matter into it, which will again hold water, or provide supplemental irrigation like what we were talking about. But sand will not hold water. It just goes right through it.
Yeah, I didn't like it. I'm not a fan of the sandy soil.
I'm in agreement with you. And I'm not a fan of some of this tight clay that we've got either, because, you know, as you deal with that type of soil, if you add water and if you get too much and trying to cultivate and so forth, do you know how you make brick?
With the clay.
With that red clay and water, and then you just bake it just a little bit. That's all it takes to make a brick. So that's what we end up with if we don't handle our soils properly and manipulate them or try to cultivate them when it's wet. So that's one of the issues that we deal with. There's an industry that has been a thriving industry in the area from Roanoke down, sort of in a band that comes basically through our area and goes down into the northern part of North Carolina, where brick have been a staple type of manufacturing. A lot of they just mine the soil and form it and color it and bake it, and they send brick all over the country because of that. So they're using the soil that they have and shipping it out in a little 3x6 type of things used to build houses. So, but as we talk about temperature, the statement, and this is one that comes up on tests quite often, about what is the most important factor for plant growth. Temperature determines whether or not you can grow a plant. At times I have included the idea. I usually watch some of the TV shows on the History Channel that originate in Alaska, and I'm amazed by the fact that there's a 6 or 7 week period in the summer that they attempt to grow a crop in Alaska, but they're growing it in situations that are quite unique, and they have to be very selective with the crops that they grow. They don't grow tomatoes, they don't grow sweet potatoes because of it's not adapted there, but they'll grow some cabbage, some greens, some cool, what we call cool season crops. But it adds greatly to their diet because they can have some fresh vegetables and so forth. So, but temperature makes a difference in what you can grow. I was talking about cabbage in our area because of the cooler nights and cooler temperatures that we have. When we get to South Boston and South Hill and Alberta and Teesville and so forth, you guys primarily emphasize things like tobacco, corn, soybeans, and even on the eastern edge of your service area, you've got cotton. Go just a little farther down, you've got peanuts. Cotton and peanuts will grow in our area, but not in a profitable fashion. Now, we do have some corn and soybeans, and tobacco, but it's the differences in the temperatures that are there and the moisture in the soil determine what crops are grown. But temperature is a key component in that. And that temperature is brought about by the amount of radiation that the sun puts on the earth, and it is determined by the elevation. As we've talked about it before, elevation where you guys are in Southside is 500 feet plus or minus. Where we're sitting here, where Tyler and I are, is about 900 feet. Our house is almost 1,200, and the crest of the mountain, where I was talking about the cabbage thriving, is about 3,000. So, and as we talk about this, the sun's rays heat the surface of the earth, and at night, what happens to that heat?
Bleeds out.
It what?
It bleeds out.
Well, I don't like your term bleeds out. That's not really what we do. It's radiated out. Yeah. So, as we talk about the sun warming it during the day and then during the night, we lose that heat to radiational cooling. What happens if we have a cloud cover at night? What happens?
Doesn't that help retain the heat?
Is what?
Doesn't it help retain the heat?
It helps to retain the heat. That cloud acts just like a blanket.
Hey!
So
Oh, sorry, we just have an intruder. No biggie.
Intrusion is fine.
Yeah,
That's okay.
She's early for her animal science class. She's
All
dedicated.
right, well, we'll have to determine a mechanism to torture her in another minute.
Yes.
Okay, maybe just sitting in there's enough torture for us. We won't. But the heat that goes off the earth is radiated off, and at night will and if you've got cloud cover, it will act as a blanket and hold a lot of that heat in, and it varies with the altitude, the height above sea level as to the temperature increases. Generally, it's thought of that from where my home is at say 1,200 feet to the elevation at the top of the mountain at about 3,000 feet, there's generally about a 10-degree difference in the maximum temperature during the day, and there's also about a 10-degree difference in the minimum at night. So that's going to be a contributory factor as to the length of the seasons that they have at that higher elevation, and it's going to determine a lot about the types of crops that they can have, because they can have some shorter season crops than what we can have at home because the frost dates are different. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along. But heat transfer is done by convection in most cases. And convection is the movement of heat through the air by a carrier. And as Carol was mentioning there a while ago, she was talking about Erie, Pennsylvania, and the difference in the temperatures and the way things were there. There is quite an agricultural enterprise that survives on the eastern side of the Great Lakes. There's a
I have to worry about as much watering of like a cornfield.
right, because you get more moisture. The air coming across that lake will pick up moisture, and when it gets over land, you'll get showers and rainfall and storms. So that the area around that lake is tempered by temperature, and it also provides more moisture. In the wintertime, if you listen to the weather forecast, they'll say, well, the temperature in say Philadelphia is going to be 45 today, but the temperature on Pittsburgh may only be 33. Because in the winter, that body of water was cold, and it tempers the air coming across. And that's why you get things like that they refer to as lake effect snows, because that moisture is picked up as you come across that lake, and when it gets over the land, inland you may only get a flurry, but you may get 12 inches there on the edge of the lake. But during the summer, these areas just east of these lakes provides an opportunity for highly valued crops to be grown in that area. There is a sizable vegetable industry on the eastern side of Lake Michigan in an area called Benton Harbor. They're about to reach their peak right now with the production of vegetables in this area. It's highly valued in loam soils, and they grow an awful lot of vegetables there. And that lake that's been warm this summer is going to temper the air coming across it. And they've got probably an extended, harvest season compared to the rest of the state of Michigan, because that lake's going to warm that, and they'll probably still be able to harvest tomatoes, cucumbers, and squash there towards the 1st of November. So it's, these large bodies of water greatly affect the types of production that exist. As we talk about temperature with respect to land and water, we've already discussed the idea that the water tempers the air coming across. So that means in the springtime that land just east of the large bodies of water, or the Great Lakes, it's going to be cooler for an extended period of time. And this is because the water temperatures change more slowly than the soil temperatures. Why would that be? Why would there be a difference in the change in temperature between the ground and the water?
Depending on where you are in relation to the ocean.
No, that's not really what I'm getting at. That's true, but that's not really. All right, the water is a solid. It's a solid mass, and the soil or the ground around that is going to have air pockets in it, and that air is going to cool faster than that water.
Because water retains the heat.
Water retains the heat or retains the cold, either one, whichever one we're talking about, depending on the season. So large bodies of water will moderate the temperature, depending upon whether we're talking about the spring or the fall. So,
I have a question. Could you irrigate crops with salt water? Would that kill them?
generally, it will kill them. Now, you'd have to treat the water to take the salt out, and then that gets to be an expensive process. But they're working on the science to do that. So, but generally, if you and some crops tolerate salt, but most of them do not. It can be a liability. So, all right. As we talk about temperature, also we've talked a little bit about the radiational cooling. The term frost pocket comes up, and that's not because Tom's got an ice cream cone in his pocket. It's
I'm not telling.
but when we're using the term frost pocket, it's very common when we're talking about perennial crops. That's one of the first things that my dad taught me when we were talking about the apple orchards that we had, because apples are subject to frost in the spring, and we made a real effort not to put any apple trees in the lowest areas that we've got. As an example of what I'm speaking of, have any of you ever ridden a motorcycle late in the evening? Or driven a car with the window down, your arm hanging out? Come off a hill and go down through a low point? There's any change in the temperature?
Your arm is going to freeze.
Tyler says your arm's going to freeze. It may not freeze, but you'll notice the difference. Now, why is that?
Temperature drops as the altitude gets lower.
You're swinging it, yeah. Tyler says the temperature drops as the altitude gets lower. Yeah, as the sun goes down, we get changes because of the radiational cooling, and the cold air is more dense than the warm air. And it will flow just like water. It'll go down a hill. So the cold air will collect in the lowest points that you've got. And it will make actually what we call a frost pocket. If you're familiar, happen to, well, we're coming on, it hadn't been this week, it's been mid-80s, but in the next 3 or 4 weeks, in our area, we'll begin to get some cooler nights. And, as I leave my house in the morning, we'll, at 1,200 feet, I drive about 1.5 miles, and I'll drop down to a little stream bed there, and it'll be 500 or 600 feet lower than it is at the house, and it'll be cold enough that there'll be frost in the grass there because of the movement of the cold air down in that hill. But a frost pocket is an area that is a lower elevation where the cold air collects, and it's something that producers need to be aware of. The guys that are planting crops like tobacco in these bottomlands to take advantage of the moisture that exists have to be aware of the potential for frost when they plant that tobacco in the spring. They want to make sure that the average frost date is passed, and that crop is not subject to injury by cold temperatures. And tobacco is really sensitive to cold temperatures. So, another term that comes about as we talk about frost pockets and air movement and radiational cooling is a term called temperature inversion. And if you haven't studied this, you may not be aware of what a temperature inversion is. But temperature inversion means that there is a layer of warm air above a layer of cold air that is closer to the surface. The temperature inversion means it's actually a layer of warm air traps cold air down close to the surface. And over the next 3 or 4 weeks, as the temperature begins to cool off, you will see folks that may build a fire in a fireplace or a wood stove, and you'll see, particularly, it's got to be on a still morning, you'll see the smoke come up and quite often level off. You ever noticed a layer of smoke that lays out over a particular area in the country? That's a visual expression of a temperature inversion. That smoke went up to a certain level, and that's where the layer of warm air was that was over that little valley or the area where if you not aware of it, don't think about it, you don't pay any attention to it. But that's a visual example of a temperature inversion. And folks that are concerned about planting crops either in the spring or sometimes in the fall, but more often it's in the spring, they're concerned about protection of flowers for apples or peaches or something. Sometimes even grapes, if crops break bud early or begin to flower, there will be an opportunity to take advantage of a temperature inversion. Because the temperature inversion, you've got the warm air at the top and cooler air below. And when I worked in Winchester, there were a couple of guys that would hire helicopters. When apples were blooming, they'd hire a helicopter to go out and fly over these low areas where there was potential for frost damage, and that helicopter was mixing the air. We would stir the air, the warm air that was above with the cold air that was below. And in theory, and quite often it worked, to prevent frost damage in these lower areas. A lot of the particularly areas in California, some in Florida, I even know of a vineyard, large vineyard operation that's put in wind machines to stir the air to avoid potential for frost damage. So,
for the fun of it, I put a picture up. I'm talking so my camera will show up. It is showing smoke out of a smokestack, but it still is doing the same behavior that you get clouds and stuff. Just so you can visually see it for you visual people.
Where is that?
Yeah.
I just pulled it up off the internet. I don't know.
Carol, it'll occur. If you're observant over the next 30 days, you'll see that. As temperatures begin to change and get cooler, you'll get up some morning and start to school, and you'll notice that people have fires around, and if it's still, now if it's windy, it's not going to happen because it's all automatically being mixed by Mother Nature. But if it's a still, quiet morning, you'll see that layer of smoke that appears. We run out of time. I'm sorry. Went over a little bit.
Rick.
We'll talk about temperature some more when we get back together next week. Guess it'll be next Thursday, though.
Yes.
No, yes.
Thursday, so yes,
I'll be
Thursday.
here.
Wait, when next Thursday?
Okay.
The way we do classes, any school,